Hey everybody. What I wanted to do is just really quickly go through and offer you kind of a mini lecture in terms of a voiceover with our content. So really when we're talking about the basics of communication and getting rolling, really I just want to go over some basic definitions, maybe a brief history of communication and how it became a field in which it's currently studied, and then really just review some of the key kind of areas of communication, the different types of communication in which we'll briefly kind of go over throughout the course of the semester. So first things first, just a basic operating definition. It's the process of constructing meaning by sending and receiving verbal and nonverbal symbol and signs that are influenced by multiple contexts. There's a lot going on in this definition. First off, communication is a process. We'll talk about that in a little bit more. Constructing meaning is a big part of how communication operates. It's through communication in which we create the meaning of our worlds. Basically, it's how we create meaning behind, basically just how do we establish what things mean, quote unquote, and therefore that really shapes our reality. There's this constant sending and receiving that's taking place between communicators. We're constantly in this simultaneous process of sending messages while also receiving messages. This can be done verbal and non-verbally through signs and symbols. We again, when we create meaning, we create symbols for certain things. When we talk about, what work means, well, work can mean a lot of different things, whether that means your actual job, or if you're working out, or if you're working hard on an assignment. That's symbolism, however, so we're able to connect to what might seem ambiguous. We're able to use it within a specific context that makes sense, which leads to the next part. It's influenced by multiple contexts, the environment, the relationships that are at play within any kind of communication episode. All of these things impact and influence how communication actually operates. So just breaking those things down a little bit more, communication is a process. It's continuous and ongoing. It never stops. One of the first paramount kind of understandings of communication was this idea that you cannot not communicate. And what that means is, regardless of if you're saying anything or intending to say anything, or if you are intending to non-verbally say something to somebody, when we're around people, it's pretty impossible for us to not be communicating something. Even if you're not saying words or not making eye contact with somebody, that in itself is communicating, letting a sigh out, like that communicates something. So basically, it's this idea that it's continuous, it's ongoing, and as human beings, we're constantly communicating meaning, whether or not we intend to or want to. Various different contexts. Communication is human. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, but it's basically this idea that, yeah, different animals in various ways communicate and kind of interact with each other, but that's based a lot more on behavioralism and biology-based things. Whereas as humans, we have a lot more ability and availability with our brains to create things through communication and interact with in a lot of different ways. So for the purposes of our class, we're going to be looking at communication in terms of humans. Communication requires a response. Without feedback, communication isn't actually taking place. So when you're speaking with somebody, or when you're listening to somebody, head nods, eye contact, responses like, oh, yes, I understand, or no, I don't agree with that, or whatever. All those things are considered feedback. So without feedback taking place, communication isn't really happening. Communication is also symbolic. And what that means is we use symbols to represent things, processes, or ideas or events in ways that make communication possible. So right now I'm sitting in a chair. We wouldn't know what I meant by that unless we all created universal understanding surrounding that symbol and sign. So we use symbols, we create meanings for things so that we can use symbols to just make things easier when we communicate. It allows us to have common understandings about certain things, so that way that when we are communicating and interacting with one another, we know what we're talking about essentially. And we use these things to represent, again, different processes, different ideas, different events. Everything is bound within symbols. And communication is a transaction. All communication is transactional, meaning that there's this constant kind of flow and constant give and take. And there's three main elements. Again, participation is continuous and ongoing. All communication has a past, a present, and a future. So again, it's constantly on this continuum, and all communicators play a role. Anybody within any kind of communicative environment, any kind of group setting, any kind of dyadic one-on-one setting, regardless of the environment, when you're around people and they're talking, everybody is somehow playing a role. Now, some people might be playing more of a role, some might be playing less, but one way or another, all humans involved in a communicative episode are somehow playing a role and impacting that communication that's taking place in that specific environment. So just to provide a brief history of communication, communication really began with my man Aristotle here. He began the study of rhetoric. When we think of rhetoric these days, it almost has a negative connotation because we associate it with like politicians and things we're seeing on the news, and that's poor rhetoric and all that kind of stuff. But really, at the core, what rhetoric is the spoken word. It's the study of the spoken word, the study of persuasion, and how we use words to accomplish things or influence things or change people's perspective on things or influence our communities for the better, right? So, really, Aristotle began looking at public speaking, how we engage civically, how we use communication to influence one another. And, back in these days, Plato, I'll just do a little brief tag in here. Aristotle and Plato kind of had two different versions on communication, whereas Aristotle saw it as this good thing that could be enabling, that could be empowering for people, that could make positive change. Plato kind of had more of this negative view where communication was just how humans distorted reality, could lie about things and create false truths. But we're going to focus a little bit more on Aristotle because that's really where the study really started. That's where some of the basic understandings of communication actually began. Um, and then along came Cicero, which developed the five canons of rhetoric. So, whereas Aristotle kind of looked at communication in more of this broad, abstract sense, Cicero really started to break down rhetoric. And there's five canons, and the first one's invention. And really, what this gets at is how can we present new evidence, new findings, new data, new understandings, so on and so forth, in our arguments, in our conversations, in our public speeches to create new ways of thinking. How can we use new information to think differently about stuff? The next is arrangement, and this is how we actually organize things. And when we get into speeches, arrangement becomes really, really big because it's going to be how we organize the entirety of our speech in a way that makes sense. Style is how we use language. When we talk about language, really what we're referring to is style. How can you use creative, colorful, engaging, captivative, emotionally charged, et cetera, words and language in a way that's going to best benefit you or best serve your needs or wants or desires within any kind of communicative context. Delivery is about the characteristics of the speaker, how they use their body, how they use their voice, tone, pitch, rate, speed, all that stuff with their voice, how they use nonverbal gestures, how they make eye contact or not. Really, all of those things fall under delivery. And then memory, this is more about being able to retain and repeat information and repetition within communication. So this is really how communication started and how it developed. And really from here, it's how humans began exploring more and more about communication and its role really within society and for humans. Sorry about that. I accidentally put two animations in. So what are the types of communication? We'll go into each one of these a little bit, but to jot them down for now, it's intrapersonal, interpersonal, group communication, public communication, and then mass communication, which we'll focus on mass a lot less in this course. Mass communication is really a field. I mean, all of these are fields that can be studied in themselves, but mass communication is kind of its own animal. So we're going to avoid that one a little bit, but we'll still work with a basic kind of definition. Once again, I don't know what I did to my PowerPoint slides here. Bear with me. But intrapersonal communication, this really gets at communication with the self. You know, when you're thinking to yourself, that's what intrapersonal communication is. And it's really involved with a lot of internal and reflective thinking, thinking about things that you've done or thinking about various things that you witnessed. If you just watch two people get in an argument, you know, like out in public, you might be reflecting on that and thinking about that and asking, why did that happen? Why could that have possibly been? Couldn't they have done it somewhere else? All of those kinds of things. And relating to that, like all communication, it's triggered by a stimulus. So an example, you know, if you're walking, you know, through the mall or through a store or you know, down the street or whatever, and you see somebody with a haircut you really like, that might trigger internal thoughts to yourself, not only like, oh, I think that haircut's cool, it looks really nice on him or her, but it might also lead to you thinking about different haircuts you might want to get and thinking about what you might look like with different kind of haircuts. And you're having this whole internal kind of conversation, right? And it really helps us just kind of understand stuff, reflect on stuff, make sense of stuff, understand our surroundings better. So we use communication internally in a lot of ways just to, again, better understand our environment and make sense of stuff. We do intrapersonal communication for a lot of other things too. But basically, it's just, again, it's communication with the self. It's internal, it's reflective, it's caused by a stimulus, and we really do it for a lot of different reasons. It plays a huge role with self-concept and identity, specifically. The looking glass self, this is one of our earliest kind of comm theories. It's this idea that we understand who we are based on what's reflected back to us by others, by other humans, by the ways that other people interact with us and reflect things back to us. So if you think about it, it's like you have a mirror in front of you, and what's reflected back to you is you, right? But the mirror isn't a mirror, it's other people, it's other interactions, it's the other side of the communication that you're having. And what's reflected back to you is how you come to kind of understand your identity in a lot of ways. I strongly encourage you to go out and give Looking Glass Self a Google and check it out a little bit. Really interesting theory. But at the very core, it gets at, again, this idea that when we are out interacting with people, you know, if you do something and somebody says, oh, that was really nice of you to do that, you know, we take that to heart and we take that to our self-concept. When we get in trouble for something and we're scolded or grounded as kids or whatever, you know, that impacts us and it makes us think a little bit about, you know, what's going on, why did I get scolded, so on and so forth. So the looking glass self, it's really about how external communication influences how we come to understand our identity as individuals. Yeah, double animations. Interpersonal communication. Interpersonal communication, I think of it in terms of synonymous with interpersonal relationships. You cannot have interpersonal relationships without interpersonal communication. We form, we maintain, we destroy everything relationships through communication. You need at least two communicators for interpersonal communication. It can sometimes be more than two, but two is at minimum. You need two folks interacting with one another to have interpersonal communication. And it's really embedded with goals. We use interpersonal communication to meet instrumental and relational needs. You know, if you need to express that you're angry at somebody, you're stewing on something they did and you're upset about it and you need to express that, you have to use interpersonal communication and have an interpersonal conversation with someone to express that you're upset, you want that problem's fixed, you don't want to be upset anymore, and you need that other person to somehow help you in order to do that, right? That's just one example, but basically within any kind of interpersonal relationship, we use interpersonal communication to try to accomplish a lot of different things. And it's complicated because relationships are complicated. And that's why communication is such an important tool for our relationships, our variety in our friendships, romantic relationships, professional relationships. Good interpersonal communication skills means you have a leg up when it comes to navigating interpersonal relationships. And then moving on, once all my animations express their need to be a part of this. Small group communication. This is 3 or more people, and there's a common goal in which every person can participate with other members. And when it comes to small group communication, this is often a little less voluntary than our interpersonal communication, right? Interpersonal communication often is because we are in relationships that we kind of volunteer for, or they've really been a part of our life. Friendships are often voluntary. Romantic relationships are voluntary. Family communication, not so much voluntary, but in many cases it kind of becomes that way. It kind of becomes a no-brainer. But small group communication also applies to the family in ways in terms of how the family operates as a system. We can look at the ways in which we work on school projects together. That's considered small group communication. When you're assigned to a team to complete something, that's small group communication. Anybody that's been on sports teams or a student senate or any other kind of work group or extracurricular group in high school, that's where small group communication takes place. So it's really more interesting. It's very goal oriented, and there's a lot of different roles that emerge with small group communication. And as I mentioned, it's not as voluntary as interpersonal communication. So we'll study a little bit of small group communication this semester as well. Public speaking, this is the part nobody or most folks don't like about this class, but it's going to be an integral piece of learning about communication. Public speaking, it's much more controlled by the speaker with a larger audience, an audience of usually more than just a few people. It's usually a pretty large group of folks. And the speaker really kind of controls the tempo. They control what's going on in that setting. There's an unequal amount of speaking. Again, it's more of the speaker with an audience member or a group of audience members listening. There's limited verbal feedback, but when we get into public speaking, we'll talk about feedback and how we use nonverbal feedback and different things that the audience is trying to communicate to us and how we can use that while publicly speaking. And there's a greater chance for speakers to plan what they're going to say ahead of time. Whereas with interpersonal communication, small group communication, it's often a lot less structured, a little more free flowing, and a little less just kind of planned out. Whereas with public speaking, as a speaker, you have time to prepare your speech. You have time to learn a little bit about your audience to know how you can say things that are going to connect with them. You have time to practice. You have time to dig up interesting information and statistics to support your arguments while making a public presentation. So they're more structured and you have more time to kind of plan ahead of time in terms of what you're going to say. And then really the last section, again, we're not going to focus on this so much in this class, but I just wanted to make sure you understood what mass communication was. This is really more of print or electronic kind of media. And this is where one source communicates out to many, many, many receivers. I mean, everything we do on social media can be viewed as mass communication, radio, television, newspaper, tweets, all that stuff. Anything technologically based can really be viewed in terms of mass communication. And just the key again is it's usually one kind of source and it's being disseminated out to many, many, many other sources. It's not limited by time and space, meaning you don't have to be in a specific location at a specific time to access that information. And again, it's all about one source getting out towards many, many other sources.